Hello, everybody. Today, we welcome you at our Startup Leaders Club online panel discussion by inspirational leaders of innovation and drivers of change. And today we discuss the impact of COVID-19 on global tech, Series 8. And I will introduce myself and my co-moderator, Giampaolo Parigi. My name is Nadia Nesterova. I'm independent director of the board of the National Alternative Investment Management Association and advisor to a number of leading GPs, hedge funds, private equity, venture firms, hedge funds, as I mentioned, and also heading Real Assets Committee at NEMA. So Giampaolo Parigi is a venture capitalist and chair of the board of Single Family Office. And our speakers today is Cheryl Conti, CEO of Do Big Things, Seth Page, CEO of Strategic Partnerships of Thoughtput, Dr. James Bauer, CEO of Virtual Words IP, Mike Kale, CTO of Everest.org, Adam Wainroth, Chief Marketing Officer of Invoiced. And I give a round of introductions and give a word to each of you. Cheryl, could you please introduce yourself? And you're also Amazon #1 bestseller writer. Also introduce your book briefly, of course.
Thank you, Nadia. Hi, everyone. I'm Cheryl Conti. I'm the CEO of Do Big Things. Do Big Things is a digital agency working with the world's leading causes and campaigns to provide the new narrative and new tech for the new world in which we all sense that we're living in. I am the author of Mechanical Bull, #1 Amazon bestseller in certain categories. It's the story of my journey in startups. My tech startup, Attentively, which provided influencer engagement and social media marketing support for the nonprofit sector, became the first tech startup with a Black female founder, myself, on board to become acquired by a NASDAQ company, Blackbaud. So it was a social impact startup acquired by a social impact corporation. So I'm really excited to be here with this distinguished panel. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Cheryl. And James, you are not the first time at our panel discussion, so please introduce yourself again.
Sure, should I do a different introduction or no, I'll do the same one. So yeah, I'm Jim Bauer. I'm actually a computational neurobiologist. When I went to Caltech in 1983 to start the first graduate program in computational biology in the world, I also at the same time thought it would be interesting to start to explore how this technology could be used to change education more broadly. So worked for 17 years basically to figure out how to use computers and networks and simulation technology to influence and educate kids kindergarten through 8th grade. And in 1999 formed a company, New Media Incorporated, which launched Yville, which was a site to really do research and development and how to use the internet and simulation technology and games to learn. Currently, Yville has about 8.7 million registered users, 78% female, average age 13. Quite a few of them, I think, are watching this broadcast, actually. And there have been many peer-reviewed academic papers published on Yville. And basically, in 1983, we thought maybe at some point the world would turn to online digital technology for learning, and lo and behold, like it or not, they seem to be at the moment. And I'm happy to be here as well.
Thank you, James. And Mike?
Hi, thanks everyone for joining us. Mike Kyle, CTO of Everest.org. I'm here to bring down the average IQ of this esteemed panel. So Everest is a fintech cloud platform with foundational digital identity that's coupled with an Ethereum-based digital wallet to power various financial transactions and adhere to things like the FATF travel rule and all of the financial regulations that are either current or forthcoming thanks to the rise of cryptocurrencies. Prior to that, I was in the executive enterprise world. So I ran IT operations at Netflix, and I was also CIO and SVP of infrastructure at Yahoo.
Thank you, Mike. And Seth?
Yeah, hi, Seth Page, 8-time startup founder, 6 exits, done hundreds of deals around the world, fundings, M&A, IPOs, secondaries with angels, VCs, private equity, hedge funds. The current one, my most recent, where I'm COO and co-founder, is Throughput. It's an industrial AI company that uses your existing data and your existing teams to actually detect the waste and the bottlenecks across your entire supply chain, and then apply AI to that to actually root out and lean out that additional working capital that's locked up in your current, in your current operations that can be put to more productive uses. And if you look at the big picture, you've got a $35 trillion global production market, of which 1/3, roughly 11 trillion, is waste. When the entire tide is rising, no one really thinks about it because everyone's making money for the most part in the industrialized world. But when we're in the world like now with COVID, suddenly people care about, how do I actually squeeze more from my operations? How do I make money, hit my EPS numbers, and not have to lay off 25, 30% of my staff? So that's what we do all the time. We focus on using existing data, and we help people get to the digital transformations, the industrial IoT projects they want to do, but don't have the capital to do. So we are the baby steps to get them there. And thank you for having me.
Thank you, Seth. And Adam?
Hi, this is Adam Weinroth. I'm Chief Marketing Officer for Invoiced. I've been doing marketing and product leadership kind of work for a couple decades now for a variety of software companies. I'm now with Invoiced, which is a very innovative fintech platform focused on accounts receivable automation. And today is a spectacular day to be doing a webinar and representing Invoiced, because today is actually National Accounts Receivable Appreciation Day. So if there are any folks out there who are involved with collections, billing, AR, accounting, finance, etc., we salute you, because you're playing a really important role right now out on the front lines of helping businesses get paid and be successful. Really glad to be here.
Thank you, yeah.
Accounts receivable is one of my favorite things, Adam. So I appreciate it every day.
It's hot. You have no idea.
Oh, I think I do.
Thank you for celebration. Giampaolo, would you also introduce yourself?
Well, good day, everyone. No, I don't reintroduce myself. You've been so kind already to do it, and many of them already know me, but I'm a venture capitalist and entrepreneur, and chairman of a single family office with keen interest on technology, emerging markets, and recombination of factors. So I would like to start right from set with my first question, because I think the reconfiguration of activities so that they become leaner and more efficient, I think it's one of the main topic today, during and after, especially after COVID-19. Seth, what's your experience? What's your take now? I mean, do you see organizations changing dramatically the way that they operate to streamline operations during this pandemic, or everything goes on despite the fact that everybody pays lip service to working it better?
Yeah, no, I mean, you have to. I mean, particularly public companies, if you look at it, they live and die by their EPS numbers in their range. So when they're not hitting EPS, executives don't make their bonuses, dividends don't get paid. So everyone's trying to figure out, how do I cut my costs so I can increase my bottom line, so I can hit the bonuses and everyone's happy. In a market like now, that's virtually impossible, right? You have to find new ways of doing that. You have to find ways of leaning out. The playbook up to now that most hedge funds or public companies or private companies use is let's just do a 20, 30, 15% across the board budget cut, which means you're cutting the muscle and the protective tissue along with the fat, which really isn't good for your long-term prospects as a company, particularly R&D. And some of your better people will take packages and leave because they know they can get employed elsewhere better. And the second thing they'll do is just a riff, right? Because people are almost always your source. The problem is that is where most of your institutionalized knowledge lies. So if you look at it, we have customers who we worked with, large global conglomerates before the pandemic and the ensuing economic crisis. We have all the data of what was going on before then and how we were helping them to squeeze out tens of millions of dollars out of their supply chains and operations. And that for them is just pure profitability. Some of these companies are the most profitable public companies or in the top 5 in their countries. And these are, top 10, global national leaders. At a time like now, it becomes an absolute necessity. You have to cut out that fat. And if you have approximately 30% waste caused by various types of operational and process bottlenecks across your entire operations and supply chain, the first place to go and the best place to go is there, because you don't have to lay people off and you don't have to make unwise budget cuts with a chainsaw. You can actually go in with a scalpel, focus on those bottlenecks that are causing the waste, free up your throughput, increase your flow, and start to hit those EPS numbers that are better and outsized relative to your peers, which ultimately lets your stock take off and executives are happy, shareholders are happy, and you become the winner in the group. Some companies do better than others, but right now you're seeing a lot of layoffs, a lot of cuts. At least in the US, you're looking at over 30 million jobless. If you take independent contractors and sole proprietors into that number, who aren't making a living right now, the number's closer to 61, 62 million. So this is, no one knows if it's going to be a V or a U or an L or a J or a bathtub shaped recovery. And this is my 4th economic recovery as a professional adult, 6 since I've been alive. It's you can never really know the future, but there are certain things you can do by your playbook to make sure that you bring the cost down, bring it under control, keep your best employees, and find that fat, find those inefficiencies in your operations, because that's where your working capital is locked up, and that's where you can free it up to reinvest it in the company and your people and in retaining the best folks.
Thank you.
And I have a question for Cheryl as well. So, with regard to your book, so you wrote it a bit before, I think, the current situation. So what type of advice, for instance, which you mentioned there for startups in terms of how to survive and succeed, you would recommend? And what would you have changed or added to that?
Thanks, Nadia. I don't think that I would necessarily change anything. The Chinese have a saying, where there's crisis, there is opportunity. And, to Seth's point, there's an awful lot of people who, were small business owners, independent contractors or sole proprietors, or, people who find themselves out of work, who, can look around and say, okay, what are ideas, right? How things are changing, and they're going to change in some ways permanently. How can I surf that trend? Do I have an idea? And then can I build a team around that idea? Can I build a business model around that idea? Can I start to attract funding around that idea to bring it to life? And so the book, Mechanical Bull, How You Can Achieve Startup Success, it has a lot of great quotes and stories from smart people, just like the people here on this call who are investors or founders or both. It's not just my voice. And it goes through the startup life cycle, from I've got an idea to exit. And some lessons along the way, particularly those who may be, quote, non-traditional investors for whom this is new. They may not have the same networks or knowledge as others. This gives you a fighting chance. And, I think that in some ways there's never been a better time to start a new business if you have a business that you think can succeed, in the environment to come. Look, we're headed fully into a digital first future. And so anything that takes a service or a product that people were using and provides it to them, in a place that they may be more comfortable, such as home, is likely to succeed right now, in my opinion.
Thank you. And James, you had a question to Seth as well.
Sure. It's a COVID-19 question specifically. And I was involved in the early days of the neural networks movement, so I understand machine learning, and the parameters are what matters. So one of the things that has come up, people talk about thinness in supply chains, right? So my question is, if making supply chains more efficient also potentially makes them less robust. And we're seeing now in supply chain problems around the world, finding syringes, for example, that robustness may matter. So I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on that. but
Seth,
you
we
need
don't
to
hear you.
unmute yourself.
Hello? How about now? Can you hear me?
That's good.
Great. Yeah, sorry, I don't know how that happened. The things that people typically associate with robustness in the supply chain is to hold too much inventory, which above a certain buffer level is just working capital, right? It's locked up working capital. So the problem typically isn't that the supply chain doesn't have enough of something. We have enough toilet paper, we have enough chicken, we have enough milk, we're pouring it out everywhere. You know, what's happening is that you don't have the actual last mile support. You've got two different supply chains built up, for example, in the food supply industry to restaurants, where it's not packaged and no one at the federal or state level initially took the initiative to move it over to the other supply chain. What you really want is what's called an anti-fragile supply chain, right? If you think of just-in-time purely as one of the best practices of many, just-in-time can be very easily interrupted, which is why you typically have those key suppliers located relatively close to the main factories or assemblies where they're happening from a manufacturing point of view. Anti-fragile looks across the entire supply chain. It's looking at all of the different bottlenecks. It's looking at, think of like Eli Goldratt or Deming. It's looking at, you know, the largest bottleneck that's causing the biggest impact, quantifying that, looking at the reservations up and down using AI and various data sources, and then being able to say, what are the optimal buffer levels, not inventory, but buffer levels for each one of those to keep this running. And as things change in real time or near real time, how do you adjust those? Because again, it's often not a case of manufacturing. It's often the case of the wrong parts, the wrong things, the wrong stocks, the wrong inventories in the wrong place at the wrong time. And you can take steps to do that. It's just that most companies haven't. You know, most companies, over 90% of companies haven't gone through a digital transformation, right? They talk about industrial IoT, they talk about Industry 4.0, they talk about digital transformations. But the reality is, if you go to a factory floor, not the IT department, but the actual operations, most factories are whiteboards, they're blackboards, they're Excel 2003 running on a Windows XP laptop with duct tape holding it together, and people are writing numbers down. The shift manager types it into Excel, Excel pushes it to some database, and that's it. And the Parker Hannifin database is doing something over here, ABB is doing something over there, Siemens has something over there. There's a bunch of legacy silos, they're not connected. OT doesn't know what a data lake is, they don't know what a cloud is. None of that stuff's going on in a big scale. And that was before the economic crisis. Right now, those budgets are gone completely. And the first thing to get cut is our innovation budgets. So you have to be able to take existing data and enable the existing teams to use that data and give them actionable insights they can actually execute on to keep their operations running more smoothly. And if when you empower them with that, it's huge, because that's where you not only cut out the fat, it doesn't mean necessarily doing lean or just in time at all, right? There's dozens and dozens of different methodologies that we put into algorithms and put into our AI engine called Eli. They're solving for all sorts of problems. And the key thing is keeping a throughput or a flow going through your system. That's the main one. And that could be, you know, that could just as easily be thermodynamics, throughput economics, throughput accounting, just in time, Kaizen, Yokotan, Lean Six Sigma, all sorts of various actual physical sciences as well go into that. It's not about being lean at all. It's about being anti-fragile and maximizing your throughput. And if you have that going, then you're actually replying to demand as opposed to supply, right? Demand is pulling it through your system as opposed to you trying to pick it. We typically find tens to hundreds of millions of dollars of over inventory at large companies globally because they tend to stock up on way too much too early in anticipation of selling off later in the year versus being able to pull it through the entire year. When pandemics come in black swan events, if you don't have an anti-fragile system, if you aren't able to deal with bottlenecks as they start to occur and shift, that means you automatically are going to have stock outs, starve outs, oversupply in some places, undersupply in other places, and you can't move the right resources to the right place to keep the lines moving, to keep the supply chains. And we're seeing that across the board, from the most complicated supply chains in Japan, in the US, in Europe, in China, to the simplest supply chains. And in many cases, it's the simpler supply chains that people are hacking around and figuring out how to get things from point A to point C, whereas the complicated supply chains aren't.
Thank you, Seth. Mike, what do you see in terms of new products coming out of this tunnel of COVID-19 from your perspective?
Just a quick point on what James and Seth touched upon. I think the pandemic caught a lot of companies very flat-footed. Like in great economic times, people are spending money. They're not really caring about operational efficiencies. And this rapidly exposed those inefficiencies. And then as a startup, like you need to have financial rigor and discipline, even in the best of times, because you don't know what your sales cycle is going to be. You have to weather any type of storm, whether it's a global pandemic or something very minor, because anything minor to a startup isn't that minor. I think what it's also done is, the buzz phrase of digital transformation means different things to different people. For those startups that are really powering digital transformation, it's a great opportunity for them to help larger companies and accelerate their go-to-market strategy. So I think, like Cheryl said, like crisis often leads to some great opportunities.
Thank you, Mike. Adam, what's your view on this?
Yeah, I think what Mike just said is really relevant. I think we're actually seeing, at least from my vantage point, a transformation of digital transformation. And so, digital transformation is now becoming less of an aspiration, and it's becoming more of an existential necessity. And I think that the good news is that once we start to get to a point where we can see that teeny tiny light at the end of the tunnel, the businesses that adapt accordingly and don't just kind of sweep it under the rug with, lots of venture capital in the bank, actually do the hard work of achieving operational efficiency, they're going to have thicker skin, and they're going to be more successful, and they're going to be the ones that rocket back into, healthier operations sooner and more strongly as we come out of this.
Thank you, Adam. Cheryl, what do you see Silicon Valley going? I'm interested to hear your writer's angle on it.
Sure, would love to. Let me get to that. I do want to riff off, what Adam, Mike, Seth, and James have been talking about, which is, this notion of digital transformation. In my world, people think of nonprofits as nice, and they are. The work that we do that's mission driven, it feeds more than my wallet. It also feeds my soul, but it's also an $800 billion a year sector just in the United States alone in terms of nonprofits consuming services and products. So, and for a lot of those nonprofits, they have waited 10 years. A lot of them have slowed down on their digital transformation. When you talk about field groups, the type of people who fan out and get people to fill out the census or go out and vote or register to vote, those are hundreds of thousands of people around the country who, just to Seth's point, they've got their clipboards, they have an Excel spreadsheet, they are not efficient, they are not digital. It's all very primitive. And yeah, as Adam said, this aspiration of like, oh, it would be nice for us to improve, our digital game is now existential. Like there is no other way. And so I do think that we're going to find a lot of groups, and companies and startups and business, really focusing on tech, not as a nice to have, but as a, if we want to survive in this new era, we have to get better at this. We have to get more productive, more efficient. We have to apply AI and ML. So then to your question, Giampaolo, in terms of, Silicon Valley and the impact, yeah, absolutely. All eyes are here in the United States, tech led. Tech, it wasn't the government who led in the response to COVID-19 and started to, pivot how they were doing business. It was tech first. I remember I was supposed to talk at Twitter. I was giving a talk to a bunch of, women-led grassroots orgs around the country, and it was being hosted by Twitter, and they canceled it. It was, it was basically my last speaking appearance. And they said, everybody's, not only can no one come here, but everybody at Twitter needs to work from home starting today in early March. So I think that, seeing that, right? The tech is in many ways leading the way, not just in the digital transformation, but in business practices and surviving in this era. Absolutely, I think that we have a lot to teach the rest of the world.
Thank you. On the other hand, I'd like you to elaborate, because I spent 10 years in Silicon Valley as a principal of a VC firm. So I think pretty much everyone else on the panel has been or is in Silicon Valley at this moment. And I'm trying to put together what I'm seeing with Tesla, you know, and the manufacturing base that California risks to lose, the new ambition of Silicon Valley of going global, but at the same time, a certain demise of the VC world coming. VC world as we know it coming, because I think a lot of sophisticated investors are pretty dissatisfied with mainstream VC firms. And private equity has been the first victim a few years ago. I think the VC might come close to be the second one if it doesn't correct its act. Overall. And then of course there are always brilliant and stellar exceptions to this, but I would say as a bulk, and you're a writer, you see already even on prominent media in the States, there are beginning to be articles regarding, you know, how VCs are not performing efficiently or as efficiently as they're supposed to perform. And these attacks used to be there. I mean, didn't used to be there a few years ago. So I think, you know, I'm trying to put all this into the context of the new shape and form of the economy, because as I say, I don't think that, for example, California will be in the position to maintain its prominence with the VC community if it loses important portions of the economy of the state, like manufacturing, or anyway, if manufacturers are concerned about remaining or investing into California. And I'm curious to hear all of you on that. Cheryl, ladies first.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, you know, it's so interesting that you say that. I mean, you know, I think that California, as a California resident and here in Silicon Valley, I do think that they're trying to position very differently from, say, you know, the rest of the country, and say, you know, we're trying to take a really measured response, you know, to the crisis. You know, so we'll see how that impacts business. You know, they worked it out with Elon Musk, and, you know, he really wanted to open, and part of it was, you know, political and wanting attention. But at the same time, the state was already on its way to opening up. And so they just worked with him on the health and safety, you know, that needed to happen. You know, I do think you're right that there's a tension, and, you know, VC, you know, and private equity has been pretty moribund. I mean, you hear, you know, people like John Doerr saying, you know, I pattern match and I look for, you know, white guys who dropped out of Harvard and Stanford. You know, at some point you run out of new ideas from those cats, and you need to expand, you know, to other regions, you know, to other people. And so I, you know, yes, there is a threat, but where there's a threat, there's actually strengths. And I think that, you know, here there is so much untapped potential. There's so many people who have amazing ideas that just need to be convinced, you know, that need to be connected to the right capital. And hopefully this is an opportunity for people to, you know, switch their thinking and say, okay, you know, we need to invest in places we haven't invested before if we want results that we haven't had before. I think that you're right that some things, you know, whenever you have a downturn like this, some, you know, organizations that are old and stale and slow fall away, and you have new ones, you know. So in my world, that would be the NAACP, who are amazing and have been a client, and they're experiencing a renaissance, but they have now very much a competitor who came forward during a downturn, Color of Change, who is actually has more members than them at the moment. And so I think that, you know, we're going to see new, you know, VC arms, new PE companies. I think you're going to see, you know, upstarts really put pressure on some of these old, stale, you know, organizations.
Thank you, Cheryl. And who wants to be next set? Mike, James?
I think I can follow up to what Cheryl said. I think now that the game of musical chairs and free-flowing capital has come to an abrupt halt, those who have been pattern matching have to pivot and start thinking differently and investing differently. So once, like, to go back to what I said before, I think this crisis is going to lead to a lot of great opportunities, a lot of new areas to invest, and areas for entrepreneurs to really shine, instead of trying to be the next gen widget or whatever app. Like, actually solve some real problems, whether it's addressing the lack of resiliency in supply chain, bridging the gap between the IT teams and the operational people on the floor to eliminate the multiple spreadsheets and whiteboards, blackboards. There is a lot of areas to improve operational efficiency. And I think this hopefully or will force companies and startups to start doing that.
Yeah. I mean, if can you hear me, by the way? Yeah. Yes. If you look at Silicon Valley, I mean, Sand Hill Road's 2 exits up for me. I grew up here. It's real simple, right? 5% of the VCs make 90% of the returns. 75% of VCs don't beat the S&P 500 over 10 years, right? So VC is a losing prospect. VC is a bad investment. You're really focusing on about 160 people that matter. Most of those 160 people, for the most part, have worked for a company, have started a company, have worked for someone at a company, have worked their way up. They've done the hard work. They've built things. They've fired people. They've cried. They've nearly lost everything. 90+% of those folks have come from the finance sector. They came from Wall Street. They came from Boston. They came out west to make money. They care about 2 and 20, 2% fees every year, 20% carry. The LPs, right? Their investors. That's who they work for, right? We're entrepreneurs. We're just the vessel that allows them to make money. So all these little lies they whisper in our ears, for the most part, you have to understand where it's coming from. It doesn't mean they're bad people. It just means most of them don't have the answers because they've never been in that situation. Most of them are well-educated, Ivy League, white males, by way of the industry. And there's a lot of diversity push. There's a lot more women and minorities coming in, but it's a splash in the bucket. And you just have to look at the trends, right? Why are they lemmings? Why do they pattern match? Because it's what they do. They don't know any better, right? You have to have creative thinking. You have to have real experiences to go out and try something different. So if someone sees Nest getting acquired and there's a huge exit multiple, suddenly, billions and billions of dollars pours into IoT, and you get an overfunding, right? You get a super hype cycle that goes on all the time in these very thematic investing. Too much money pours in. At some point, there's too many companies chasing too few dollars, right? It's Amara's law. And you come to the top of the cycle. And at that point, the smart money keeps doubling and tripling down on who they think the winners are, usually 2 or 3 players like, Mike Yahoo back in your day, right? Early back in the 90s. And you get a couple niche survivors, folks that make it out, and 90% of those folks are going to get washed out, right? It's the Jupiter cycle over and over and over again, creative destruction. Not a bad thing, but you just have to understand where it's at. And if you look at the average portfolio of 10 companies or 100 companies, right? Out of 10 companies, a top quartile VC is going to have 1 home run. And that 1 home run is going to give them all of their returns, a net IRR that allows them to get a second fund, which is another 10 years of 2 and 20 built on top of the first 2 and 20. And that one winner from the second fund is going to allow them to get a third fund and a fourth fund and a fifth fund. And that's how you get Ferraris. That's how you get mansions in Atherton. That's how you get that second and third home up in Idaho that you are now sheltering in place at, away from the rest of us. It's it's really a very traditional business. It hasn't changed much. It's really ripe for destruction. The good news is there's over 150 new funds that have come by, mostly from entrepreneurs who have exited, and them and folks they've worked with in the past, and angels and alternative LPs, family offices, other entrepreneurs who have done well, have come into these micro funds and these small funds, typically 50 to 100 million. And so you're seeing a lot of change at the bottom, but you have to see how those vintages actually pan out. How are they going to compare as a class, as a cohort, to the traditional, Kleiners, Sequoias, Andreessens, and all of those folks who are banking? I mean, you got to remember, Andreessen Horowitz, most of their funds haven't beat the S&P 500. The only reason why their first fund became a second fund is because they bought back Skype, right? Built it up over a year and sold it off to Microsoft. That was the winner of their first fund. It was a recycled deal. There was nothing creative in it. It could have been a private equity firm. So while Mark Andreessen is very smart and has built things from scratch, that was their one lucky child on fund one. And that led to fund 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, right? Other companies are the same. And you're seeing that at Kleiner Perkins with all the scandals and people and Mary Meikle leaving, taking the growth equity folks with her. And the early folks, it's a whole new cohort of people, and they've got to reprove themselves because, again, Kleiner Perkins has even worse performance over time than Andreessen does, right? Probably the best performing big name VC right now of this class is Sequoia on an exit basis. And that's because their brand and their capital gets them into deals that few people can. But that only persists for so long until those GPs go off and form their own funds. And at that point, you lose your talent and it's starting all over again.
Thank you, Seth. And James, you had a comment?
Sure, let me be professorial for a moment because I actually am. So we're talking about digital transformation, okay, and a digital transformation on top of digital transformation. I believe that's digital transformation squared. But, you know, we're in a very unusual time now, and COVID-19 has accelerated it, okay? I think the comparable time in history was actually basically the invention of the printing press, the way people could communicate and interact. And the interesting thing about that story, which probably most of the people on this panel know, is that Gutenberg thought the way to make money was to make very expensive Bibles in Latin and sell it to rich people. Okay, he went bankrupt. The person that really figured out how to use a printing press was Martin Luther, who made small, cheap printed stuff, put it on the doors of Catholic churches, and started the Reformation. Okay, so the point is this, and it's what we've been about since for 30-something years. You know, it's a cliche to say the internet changes everything, but it really does, and it really has. However, how it's changed it is not yet really apparent or known. Okay, the interesting thing about COVID-19, by the way, everything that Seth said about supply chain applies to our educational systems, except it's worse. Okay, they would be lucky to have the computers that are on the floors of the factories. Okay, and as primates and Homo sapiens in particular, it turns out education matters. All right, a lot of the problems you guys have and you're talking about really have to do with education. And by the way, I should say I'm white, I'm older, but I went to Antioch College, so, which some of you probably don't even know what was. But anyway, the point is this, you know, this is really a transformation. The uses of the internet so far have been, you know, pale in comparison to what it can really do. And so a big piece of the future, and COVID is accelerating that, we can see that, is in actually really figuring out what this technology does and how it can be used. Right now, and it's typical for all new technology, it's like Gutenberg, you basically use the technology to do kind of what you did before. You just move what you did before onto the internet. Okay, that's such an underuse of this device, this technology, that it's astounding. And like I said, COVID-19 with the educational system now, which is just failing, okay, because the tools available aren't the right tools. The approach available on the internet is not the right. Everyone that has a child knows this. You can see it. The teachers know it. The teachers' unions know it. Okay, so the question is, how much does COVID-19 accelerate real innovation, and more than an innovation based on a real understanding of what digital technology really allows? That's the question. And I think, just to echo the conversation on VC, I've spent some time on, you know, Sand Hill. It was usually depressing, and usually after about half a day, I just said, I'm going home. Okay, because that's not where really innovation takes place. And I think that has become clearer, and it will become even more clear. So smart capital, but that needs to be connected to a real understanding about what real innovation is and what this technology allows. So that's my soapbox speech. But the point is, everything that Seth said about supply chain applies times 10 to the educational system.
Cheryl, yeah.
Sure, just to piggyback off that, James, which all of that was so smart. I'm definitely learning from you today. You know, where COVID-19 is accelerating social innovation, social transformation, and that's coupled with digital innovation and digital transformation. And those two forces at play and how that, you know, leads to changes you know, in our world, changes in global tech is going to be really interesting to see play out, and provides a lot of opportunity for smart people and smart capital.
And smart children.
And hopefully smarter kids. Yes, Jim.
By the way, this is kids in Yville, who I asked, how long have you been in Yville? When did you first come into this site, which was built for elementary school kids? And as you can see, we now have 20 and 30-year-olds who've been in the site for 18 years. So that's what you talked about, social, right? Meeting digital, okay, and throw learning in. Why not? We've got big brains, okay? So I think that's where a lot of this innovation is going to come from, which is why we've been doing it for a while. But anyway.
I mean, it's been amazing to watch the disparities that have been there the entire time and how it's played out just in the schools. You can see it so well. If you take, you know, I'm lucky. We live 3 houses down from a Los Altos school. We're in Mountain View because it's a fourth of the price of the other side of the street. Still very expensive. Gavin Newsom came out and said, you know, everything is closing on a Friday. That afternoon, the Los Altos School District said, this is the plan. Monday and Tuesday, teachers are taking off to train. Wednesday, we're testing bandwidth. If you don't have a bandwidth or a laptop, you come from low-income family, talk to us, we'll get you one. Thursday, we're starting school, and Friday, grades start. And off we were, right? And you have families who are mostly white-collar techies, including myself, who can work from home and help their kids and be there. Where you go to my brother, who runs a bunch of coffee shops in Kauai, one of the poorest states, Hawaii, in the nation, one of the worst school systems because it's all controlled by Honolulu. The islands don't have their own independence. And when it hit, there was no plan. There was no technology. I mean, Google Classrooms was free, but you know, the people in Honolulu weren't thinking. Kauai had virtually no cases and haven't had any cases for 5 or 6 weeks, but the kids were just told, school's out for the year. Here's some optional stuff you can go see on what this Khan Academy thing or whatever. And summer school, optional. And, you know, and next year, we don't know what we're going to do. And seniors, we think you're going to graduate. We aren't sure yet. And that's been their response. And as of 2 nights ago, when I talked to my brother in Hawaii, where part of my family's from, they still haven't figured it out. So you have these, you know, massive gap, and obviously between the South and the North and rural and the cities, of not just bandwidth, and because these tools are free, right? And people have access to some limited bandwidth, but even getting people to libraries, which they can't go to, or anywhere, it's just exacerbated this gap in education in the classes, in underprivileged and underserved communities. And it's going to be interesting, probably sad, to see how that plays out over the next year or two with the kids who have had ongoing school, even if it hasn't been perfect, but it's been online and they've used all those free tools that we're using right now, and those that have nothing. And for better or for worse, are off surfing and having a good time with their friends, which is also educational and social, but they're not studying math, they're not studying English, they're not studying STEM, and they're not learning the basics for effectively the entire 5 or 6 months of the year.
Sure, just like Mike and Adam said, I mean, this situation has made clear, you know, in education as well as in business, you know, who's on top of it and who isn't.
Yep.
Yeah, there's nowhere to hide right now, right? Like you're either able to meet the moment and do the, you know, and have a digital plan that meets the social need or not. And, Jim, to your point with Luther, there was a transformation in terms of innovation, the printing press, but all of a sudden there was a reason for people to learn to read, right? Because the Bible was available. There was a reason, and to your point, Seth, at some point right now, people are deflated. They're just trying to survive this moment. But at some point, people are going to get very angry about the fact that there are these wide gaps of services and availability. And so then how does that social pressure start to put pressure, and impact, how tech responds?
Yes. And I think particularly in fall, when the secondary effects on education, a potential second wave hit, the long-term effects on joblessness or not, a V versus a U recovery or a J or an L, I think, come, and it's going to be close to election time, so it'll make it even more interesting with the politics and the rhetoric on both sides. But that's when we're really going to find out what the effects were. Because right now, everyone's just scrambling and they're trying to survive, and money is being just pumped into the system in unprecedented amounts. And there's winners and losers, but the stories are going to come out, and we're going to see what worked, what didn't work, how people were incredibly creative and innovative in solving problems, and where there was just a complete breakdown in communities and support at the state level, at the community level, at the federal level. And I don't think it's going to be a pleasant political season by any means, no matter what side of the aisle you might be on. It's just,
and that has implications for business, right? We see how the PPP rolled out, right? Where all of a sudden people said, hey, if this is intended to shore up, small businesses, the small businesses of America, if this is intended to help, the independent contractors and the solo, practitioners, how is it that these big companies that don't need it, got this money? These things are not unrelated to each other. Policy, the policies are going to impact then also, the opportunities for businesses, going forward, and what types of capital they have access to.
Yeah.
Let me just one point again for education. So in 2005, we decided that it was interesting to have our kids understand pandemics. So we launched a virus in Yville, which gave all of our 12-year-olds acne. It's called the Y-Pox. When Ebola came along, the National Science Foundation and the CDC got involved and said, hey, we can vaccinate kids. So we started vaccinating kids virtually in 2007 in Yville. When Ebola came along, the NSF said, let's have kids understand what Ebola is. So we reworked the Y-Pox into what's called the dragon swooping cough, which was Ebola-like. And one of the things we did, by the way, in 2015, was when kids got this virus in Yville, they no longer could collect their salary or run their businesses. So this is 2015, there was an economic consequence. So NSF has just asked us to upgrade this and change it to COVID-19. So there's a way, the point is, there's a way in which right now, what you guys know about the consequences of COVID-19 for society and for business is really important, and you're obviously thinking about it in a sophisticated way. That is not true for the majority of the population. So one of the things that's imperative, I think, moving forward is that we use this technology so that people who vote can actually understand, as well as VC and others can understand what's really going on and what the consequences are. Because at the moment we have an enormous gap in knowledge and understanding. You guys are watching it at the ground level in your businesses, but the majority of people who are going to vote in November have no idea what's going on. And that is something we really need to change.
Totally. These words are very important, James. Thank you so much. I think we should, bring the attention not only of the policymakers, but also of the investment community and ultimately of the families towards education. Because, too many of us have been simply transferring proxy to other entities in the hope that children could be, taken care of. And we've seen, you can't educate your children in front of Netflix necessarily by itself. So you have to do something more. And I think everybody in the constituency has to play its role. Investors, educators, policymakers, simple citizens, everyone. companies. I mean, so I think it's a good message to pass. Adam, do you want to close on this?
Sorry, yeah, I think that, the big picture here is that we just haven't done this before at this scale and at this level of impact. And so I think it's, this is an opportunity for professionals, whether you're in venture capital, whether you're in technology, whether you're a published author, whatever it is. I think there's a really an equal opportunity for people to figure this out and carve out their own leadership role. And so I just encourage everyone to do that, knowing that there is no right answer. And now that we are all hyper connected in ways that we haven't before, I probably wouldn't be doing this panel if we hadn't all, been put through the ringer of having to do every single meeting on a solution like Zoom. New ways of doing things are going to emerge. And you figuring that out is, is an opportunity for your career, for your company, for your own personal fulfillment. And don't be shy about it when you have a moment.
Thank you. And Mike, would you like to add something on that?
I'm not sure I have much more on the political front to add. I think just to reiterate, I think this, as Adam said, we've never seen this before. And it exposed a lot of chinks in the armor, whether that's in the private or public school systems, industry, et cetera. And I think we all need to think about building more resiliency into all aspects of life going forward, because this certainly will not be the first time an event like this happens, unfortunately.
And what would be your advice for those startup leaders who would like to not only to survive, but to succeed in the new reality? We hear a lot about the new normal, not only on the political scope, but primarily on innovation and finance. And you're all from different backgrounds, different industries, and most of you have gone through multiple crises. So what would be your advice? How to sustain and succeed?
I think my advice is the same as it's always been. For entrepreneurs, you need to look for white space in the market and attack or develop solutions that solve those white space areas. And I think the pandemic has exposed a lot of aspects of society and industry that need to become much more resilient. And the digital transformation and automation initiatives actually have to be accelerated. And there's tremendous opportunities across all verticals to do so. Like at Everest, we're seeing this in the fintech sector. There's still a lot of inefficiencies in the banking world. But when, like I said, when capital and money is free flowing and everybody's fat and happy, people don't spend time looking at those. And I think there's also a good portion of the world, like we talk about those who lack digital or pure identity. I think there's over 1 billion people in the world that lack any sort of true identity, coupled with the unbanked. So now is the best time to go offer a global solution around that, which is part of our initiative.
Thank you. And Seth, what would be your solution to go? What should be in the focus of attention, both for investors and serial entrepreneurs?
Yeah, I mean, it's, Mike had fantastic advice for looking for white spaces, solving real problems, right? I mean, things like supply chain. It's been an obvious that there are a lot of problems there. Operations, manufacturing, financially. Yeah, most of the modern economy still runs on legacy systems, including transportation, right? With some really nice front slick interfaces and apps now, but in the back end, you still have mainframes and AS400 running. You need to know how to program COBOL. So, but to get that into practical capital efficiency, and this is my 8th startup as a founder and executive, and I've funded many more than that. Capital efficiency is almost always an indicator of long-term success or not for those that make it. Like if you think about, we all thought Uber was this gigantic, every time I take Uber and I swipe a card, I realized they're losing money. Every time I swipe a card, they're losing money still, right? For every dollar investors put in, it's, you know, for every dollar that they get in revenue, they're spending $2 to actually to get that revenue to begin with, right? Their CAC over LTV was completely out of whack before the crisis. Same with Lyft, same with Airbnb. A lot of companies were like that. We got back to that 99, 2001, 2000 mentality of growth at all costs, throw money at it. It wasn't eyeballs this time, it was revenue, focus on revenue, revenue, revenue. And companies that had no path to profitability, but had a great revenue generation engine were going public and doing well. But like most things, the public markets figured it out and knocked a lot of them down to their knees. You know, like Peloton, like Airbnb, like Lyft, like Slack even. And it was the Zooms of the world that had very good unit economics that made it. So focus on capital efficiency, focus on growing a good company, focus on long-term profitability, even short-term, knowing that the VCs are going to want you to invest every single dollar you can to grow faster because they want you to take an outsized portion of the market. Also culture, right? Culture, especially when you're remote. I've been doing remote companies since 2001 was when we first did it, with dedicated video conferences from Polycom, right? There were no cloud tools. You were using, you know, ISDN numbers in Europe for 128, dial-up numbers, or sometimes DSL in New York City, but it was a hassle. You had to put IP addresses for us to talk. The technology was terrible. You were VPNing in with clunky tools from Cisco, but you could do it, and we did it. So if you look at it now, it's so easy to go out and grab any tool for cheap or right now for free, to try it out, to do these great conferences, to keep the culture going. Because when you don't have that face-to-face contact and you don't have that nonverbal communication, which makes up 70% of all communication, is, you know, our gestures, our talk, the way we react to each other. You need to keep the culture going, particularly when you can't see each other. And if you can't build a good culture and maintain it over time, it's going to be really hard to retain the talent and really hard to attract new talent, particularly afterwards when there's so much talent that's been laid off or furloughed in the past 2.5, 3 months. We're actually hiring people, right? Because it's a great time to pick off some very good people who are looking to be involved in anything, particularly something passionate where they're making a change in the world, and helping to, you know, actually provide better outcomes, you know, help food factories that are doing more food. We're working on COVID. You know, we've gone into New York metro hospitals and showed them before the pandemic, like James said, how to increase on a different disease, how to increase their bed capacity, their utilization of their medical equipment, and their patient flows and throughput by 20%. During COVID, we worked with those same group of doctors for the metro area, New York, to actually increase that to 40%. So why were some of these areas not having problems, even though they expected the surges? Because you were putting twice as many patients through the hospital, and we came up with a playbook through AI and their data that allowed them to do that. But that wouldn't have happened if it hadn't been for a pandemic, right? Like Mike says, people, you know, when there's plenty of money and there's a lot of fat, people don't really need to go work out.
Thank you, Seth. And Adam, so you found your white spot, and we have celebration of it today. So would you also comment on how to survive and succeed?
Sure. So I couldn't agree more with what Seth was saying about focusing on capital efficiency. If you're not capital efficient, then and you don't have a path to get there, then you're just not long-term sustainable as a business yet. And sustainability is the name of the game right now. And so, you know, I think that even the metrics that Seth pointed out are spot on. CAC, which is customer acquisition cost, LTV, which is lifetime value of a customer, making sure that those are working together harmoniously and that the ratio between them is moving in the right direction is perhaps one of the most important things that a business can be doing, especially a startup or early stage business today and when there's not a pandemic.
Thank you. And Cheryl?
What's the question?
What would be your final comment to add to resilience, sustainability? What would be your keyword so that investors and startups would focus on them?
Yeah, my keyword is creativity. This is a time to be creative and resourceful. Don't give up. Never give up. There is light ahead of this tunnel, and yeah, maybe your soul cycle, and you need to become more like Peloton. Okay, there is a way, but it does mean thinking outside of the box.
Thank you, Cheryl. And the keyword from James.
A 5% change on something we already have is not what we need and is not what's going to work. And the other thing I would say is we're in this for the long term. Okay, there's lots of hopeful thinking, magical thinking at the moment for various reasons about what's going to happen with this virus. We are very likely in this for the long term. The other thing I would say is that, and I see this because I work with literally, hundreds of thousands of children, and some of them young adults now. There's the consequences of what we're going through now with respect to the social emotional health of these kids, with respect to how they think about the future. These are the future employees, the future innovators, the future drivers, the ones that are going to invent what the future looks like. The people we work with on social emotional health refer to this as a tsunami that's coming after we get through the survival phase. And so we have to be aware of that. And we really have to be, all of us, I think, involved in helping those kids believe that there's a future and we need them.
And Giampaolo, what would be your keyword?
Yeah, I would advocate companies going from mission statements to mission practicing. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So thank you, everybody. And we move on to keynotes, and tomorrow we will also have online roadshow. And I thank everybody for participating in this great panel today. And please join us for our next sessions for business model and crisis 2020, the impact of that. So please join our sessions, and we'll be with you 24/7 on our VCTV widget. Thank you so much, and good luck. Stay